Hi everybody, welcome to CMN 201. My name is Lillian Ruiz. I'm the instructor for the class. This is perhaps the most unusual semester any of us have ever experienced. So if this feels a little bit odd to you, it feels a little bit odd to me as well. I normally teach this person in class, but I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be able to teach it online. And what I'm hoping to be able to do is to be able to translate over what I would normally do in person online. So what I wanted to do today was to tell you a little bit about the class and the way that it's structured, some of the ideas I have for transitioning it to an online format, also getting a little bit of feedback from you about what you think might make sense. And then we can begin in earnest next week once I've gathered that feedback. So in terms of this particular class, you can see that on our Moodle site at the top, you should have some documents for course syllabi and other important documents. And that's where I've posted a syllabus and a course outline for what the class would have been if we were meeting in person. And I should be able to cover the same content and to have the same assignments that I would normally have. So it's just a question of how to change things in terms of the presentation. If we were meeting in class, we would actually meet once a week on Wednesday evenings at 6 o'clock. So what I thought I would do is post videos, much like this one, every Wednesday by 6 o'clock. So that we could try to duplicate some of the content that I would normally be covering in class. And then what I thought we could do is that I would have a class discussion forum for attendance. And basically I would ask an attendance question, which you would answer, and that would count as your attendance for that particular class. And certainly, much like any other situation, if you were in class, you can participate as much or as little as you like. I know some students are very vocal in class and they participate with a lot of people, and some are more quiet and reflective, and you can learn really well both ways. So you can participate as much or as little as you like on that class forum. So that class forum would give you an idea of some of the discussions that we would normally be having in terms of the content for the material. I also thought that what I could do is to hold an optional Zoom and chat room time weekly for us. I know that with the current challenges we all have, it's very difficult to find a time where all of us are available, though I'm hopeful that we can perhaps find a time that would make a certain level of sense for most of us, so that if anybody wanted to participate in that optional Zoom and optional chat, then what I could do is set up a weekly meeting for us, and that would be an opportunity for you to engage with your peers or with me. And of course you can always make individual appointments on your own. So I was thinking that that would be the way that I would go forth in terms of presenting this class. However, I'm very eager to hear your feedback. So I'm going to ask that if you have ideas or suggestions, to please send them to my email, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And what I will do is I will compile all of that, and then I will put together a finalized syllabus for us. But again, the content was still going to be the same, whether we were meeting online or we were meeting in person. And if you were to take a look at that syllabus, which I posted, which I would have given you on the first day of class, you can see that there's some contact information there. My name is there, as well as my phone number, and also my email address as well. And certainly you can call me and leave a message. I can get back to you if you'd like, because I am checking my messages. The textbooks for this class, and there are 3 books: Projected Fears, Horror Films in American Culture; Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue; and Horror Film, A Critical Introduction. Doesn't matter which edition you use for any of these texts. I know they're available in the GCC bookstore, but you should be able to find them as well in other places online. And this is just some scholarship that has been done about horror films, a subject that oftentimes isn't viewed as very academic. However, in addition to teaching English classes, as some of you may know me as, I also teach public speaking and media classes. And in terms of media, one of the things we discuss is that you can take any kind of media and basically examine it through an academic lens, which is exactly what we are going to be doing over the course of the semester. And our course description perhaps explains that a bit better by indicating that this class is an in-depth focus analysis of a specific theme or topic in mass media. And mass media, which is one of the things we need to define next class, includes things such as film, TV, print, music, even video games, in order to examine social and cultural issues of our time, such as race and class and gender. And each semester, the instructor selects the topic or major theme of the course. And for this particular semester, as it has been for several semesters in the past, the theme is horror film. I happen to be a fan of horror film. I also teach a class in Gothic literature where we talk about many of the texts that have influenced horror film. That said, you need to have the right temperament to take a class in Gothic literature and horror film, and I suspect you probably do if you enrolled in this class. But that said, I always suggest to people, if you're going to have nightmares because we're going to be watching monsters, then this is not the right class for you. Usually instead, I have students who enjoy this sort of thing, and much like I do, and they say, bring it on. And that's perfectly fine, but I just wanted to state that right from the very beginning. The prerequisite for this class is an English 101 or an English composition class. Basically, that's an introductory English class where you've talked a little bit about writing formally and reading from a critical perspective. For GCC, that is English 101, though you may have taken that class at another institution. And if it turns out that you don't think you have that requirement, please let me know. We can talk about our options. It's recommended that you take the Media and Popular Culture class, which I offer in the summers, where we talk a little bit about the overview of what media and popular culture is, but not at all required, and both of these classes stand as independent units. So learning outcomes, what can you expect from this particular class? That as a result of successfully completing this course, students should be able to summarize scholarship of various mass media, so to understand mass media's academic relevance. Recognize and articulate symbolic and metaphoric meanings in various mass media, so to improve critical thinking skills. We'll talk about with horror films, we want to watch these films from an academic perspective, much like they are pieces of cinema that require interpretation. To identify and analyze the cultural significance of mass media, for us this would be horror film. So to understand the influence of horror film in our society. And actually one of the contentions I have is that horror film basically is a reflection of many of the anxieties and concerns of our society. To explain in oral and written form the uses, meanings, and popularity of mass media, this instance horror film, so to improve oral and written communication skills, and improving oral and written communication skills is something I've listed on all of my syllabi. To understand and draw connections between horror film and oneself, others, and society at large. So to identify horror film's social, political, and cultural influence. And that basically is the class, talking about how horror film can have social, political, and cultural influence. Number 7, evaluate and interpret data on the use and popularity of various mass media, in this instance horror film, to improve analytic skills. And lastly, to examine social issues such as race, class, and gender as they're portrayed in our topic horror film, so to better understand such issues in our society. So taking something that normally is viewed just for escapism or pleasure and to view it from a more academic perspective. The procedures, part of that would include class discussion, and as I indicated, I'm thinking that what I will do to try to duplicate that is to have a weekly attendance question in a discussion forum to which you can respond as much or as little as you'd like. A weekly Zoom and chat session so that you can discuss again in different venues, but that would be optional, the Zoom or the chat, because I don't want to necessarily assume that you are available at a particular time. And then finally, the idea of mini lectures where I would be posting videos talking about the information that I would be normally talking about in class. And that our reading and writing assignments emphasize critical thinking, critical writing, and critical analysis. A lot of critical there. And it's not necessarily criticism, but it's asking questions and interpreting and analyzing. Or doing what I oftentimes joke toddlers do really well. They always ask why. And I've oftentimes said that's the difference between high school and college. High school is where you ask what, and college is where you ask why. And the whys can be quite complex in many ways. So the course requirements that you do have to complete all of the reading and writing assignments by the due date, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the upcoming writing assignments. And since this is a class on horror film, we will be watching horror films. And what I will be doing is providing links to the horror films so that you can access those films. That said, the last couple of films may not necessarily be available on the open internet, but if that's not the case, then I will find a way to make sure that you can access that film. So you don't need to purchase any of these films. Though if you're a horror buff, you might already own some of these films. We'll see. So basically, you're expected to do reading and writing assignments by the due dates. You'll be submitting in periodic journal entries discussing your reactions to horror film. And I talk a little bit more about that in the journal section. But basically what the journals are informal writing assignments of approximately a page or so, where you're giving your thoughts and reflections about what you saw in the film and how that film might be significant in our society. And that said, because they're informal, I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, merely content. And you can write as much or as little as you'd like, and you can write things based on what you've read in our text, what you've heard in the class videos that I post, what you've heard your classmates discuss in attendance questions or any Zooms or chats that you might be able to attend, and just your own thoughts and reflections as well. And we'll be doing this for each of the major films that we will be watching over the course of the semester. So by the ending of the semester, you should have some written responses to all of the films. So that's a piece of the class, and that journal is going to be worth 30% of your grade when you put all of the journals together. And in fact, what you will be doing is writing a total of 11 journals, because we will be watching a total of 11 films. 10% is that participation that I was talking about in terms of attendance, and 30% is a final course project. And what the final course project is something that you get to analyze, something of your choice in reference to horror film. So it could be an in-depth analysis about one of the films we're watching. It could be about one of the topics that we're examining. But this is a media class, so in terms of your final project, you can use creative approaches. And I wanted to read to you the section that I have in the syllabus about the final course project, that I see it as a written analysis of horror film in a particular mass media, though there's room for more creative approaches, and guidelines will be discussed in class. In fact, I've even had students film their own horror films as final project submissions, and again with commentary afterwards about what they were doing and why. So you can feel free to be creative. And that final project is due by the last day of class. Certainly, the sooner you get it in, the better off everybody is, but you've got up until the ending of the semester. So by that point, you should have a good overview of horror film and the way that it is progressed over time. And if you are going to be submitting in text, here's some of the basics about how text should be typed and so forth. That's it. You don't necessarily have to write a paper, and all of you have the option of revising that final project if you hand it in early enough. So certainly if you hand it in on the last day of class, you couldn't revise it, but if you hand it in early enough, we would need to negotiate with that. You could hand it in, and I could give you suggestions for revision, and you could revise it. You would get the higher of the two grades for the course project. So you can see that as a learning exercise. So I encourage you to think about the course project sooner rather than later. Obviously, we'll talk about this more as the semester progresses, but I'm hopeful that the journals might provide an opportunity for some ideas that you might have for the final course project, or you can even try out some possibilities for a final course project in your journals. So, in terms of the work that you will be submitting over the course of the semester, 30% for all of those journals together, all 11 of them, 30% for your final course project, which you get to choose. If you're writing an academic paper, I'm thinking something like 4 to 5 pages, but again, there's a good amount of flexibility here. And then a final exam. And the final exam, if we were meeting in person, would be open book, open notes. So that's an easy thing to translate over into an online class. What I will do is I will just post the final exam and give you approximately 24 hours or so to take it. Open book, open notes. It'll just be a series of essay questions, and I'll ask you to choose 2 out of the series that I offer you. And that's a way for you to compile everything that we've talked about over the course of the semester in terms of horror film. There is an institutional services disability statement on the syllabus that I wanted to read to you, that Greenfield Community College values inclusion and equal access to its programs and activities, and is committed to fostering an environment of respect and full participation, and that the goal is to create learning environments that are equitable, inclusive, and welcoming. So if there are aspects of the instruction or design of this course that result in barriers to your inclusion or accurate assessment or achievement, please notify the instructor as soon as possible. And if you're a student with a disability and you may need reasonable academic accommodations, please contact the Office of Disability Services as soon as possible to discuss your needs and options. And for more information, visit the website, and the website is listed there, and there's also a phone number that you can call, especially with this semester as well, because I know that this is probably challenging for all of us. And you should know that I tend to be very flexible with my due dates. If you've ever taken a class with me before, you know that, but I especially want to be flexible now. So if it turns out that you can't make a due date, please do not panic. Just ask me for additional time, and I'll be happy to grant it to you. I think that's going to be the key for this semester, is that we all remain flexible. So if you're reading through the syllabus, you can see that I have a section there on attendance. Obviously, we're not going to be meeting in person, but assuming that we all agree, or that most of us agree, that the class discussion forum attendance question is the way to proceed, then basically what you would do is answer that question to satisfy your attendance requirement. And you have the option of being absent once over the course of the semester without that negatively impacting your grade. In other words, you could skip an attendance question. But outside of that, the idea is that you would be doing that on a regular basis, because that is part of your 10% participation grade. And then the final course project, as I was talking about, that will be the final component of the class before the final exam. That's 30%, but you can start with it as soon as you like. And there's a section on plagiarism that I'm going to skip, because we can talk about that next class. So again, in that grading section at the end, 10% participation, which is basically attendance and any optional Zooms or chat rooms that you think you might like to participate in. 30% for your journals that are graded informally, not for grammar or mechanics, on a checkmark system. So a plus is excellent, check plus is very good, check is satisfactory, and so forth. 30% for your final course project, which is graded in a letter scale, but if you can hand it in early enough, you could revise it. And 30% for that open book, open note essay final examination. And you can see that if you were to continue on with some of the documents that I've posted for the course outline, dates and assignments may be subject to change, and what you might want to do is to have the textbook with you when you're watching one of these videos, because I might be referring to a particular quote. And these readings ideally should be completed before the dates indicated below. So that hopefully when you are watching a video, you've already done some of the reading for the context of that. And you can see my disclaimer again, that pursuant to the character of the genre, some of the course material may be graphic in nature. So to give you an idea of the semester as a whole, week 1, which would be today, the 2nd of September, is purely our introduction, where I would basically give you a sense of what the class is about and hopefully get a little bit of feedback from you about how to proceed. And then we would start in earnest next class, which is where I would post a finalized syllabus. And again, the assignments would be the same. It would just be a question of the mode of delivery. And you can see that next week actually has a title called Horror Film and Fear. This happens to be our introduction to the class, where we're laying the foundation about media and popular culture and horror film. And I've suggested that what you would want to have read before the 9th would be the introduction to the text Projected Fears, Chapter 4 to the text Horror Film, and that's entitled What is Horror, Chapter 5 of the same text, which is called Why of Horror, and Chapter 6, which is entitled Critics and Censors. That will lay the foundation for our first horror film, and what I will be doing is on the 16th of September, I will be posting that particular film for you to watch, because that's what we would have done in class. We would have watched the film at the beginning of class, and then we would have discussed the film afterwards. So what I will do is have the film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, for you to view on a link for you to access. And then I will be discussing Chapter 1 of the text Nightmares, and it's entitled Origins in Film Gothic. And I'll also be discussing Chapter 1 in the horror film text, which is called Genreification. And then you can see on the 23rd, so basically I've got us meeting once a week on Wednesday evening, so to speak, as if we were doing this live. On Wednesday the 23rd is when we would all be watching Dracula, and I'll have a link to that particular movie for you to watch. And again, I'll be talking about Projected Fears, Chapter 1, which is devoted to Dracula. And in Nightmares, I'll be talking about Chapter 2, which is Studio Horrors of the 1930s. Chapter 10, Reality Bites, some punning here. And Chapter 11, Todd Browning, who happens to be the director for Dracula, if you didn't know that. This is also the time when your first journal would be due on the 23rd, and it would be due on the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So basically, we would have had a chance to establish what horror film and medium popular culture are. We would have watched Dr. Caligari, we would have talked about it, and then you would have a piece of writing due, approximately a page or so, informally. And then you would submit that journal to my email, and then I would return it back to you with my commentary. And you can see that we are continuing on September 30th by viewing the film Cat People, which you may or may not be familiar with. You can see that I've put these films in chronological order, starting with the 1920s on, so that we can get a sense of progression. And I'll post a link to Cat People. And again, I will be talking about our text, Nightmares, and that's Chapter 3, Shadow Play, and also talking about the horror film, Chapter 2, 1939 to 1973. Then we go, and there's no journal due that particular week because I wanted you to get the journal for Dr. Caligari back so you can see how I evaluate it before you start handing in journals. Because starting in October, you'll have a journal due pretty much every week with a previous film that you would have watched. We move forward to week 6, and that's entitled Horror Film in the 1950s. You can see that I've kind of divided up the weeks by decade, starting with the 1920s for week 3, 1930s for week 4, 1940s for week 5, 1950s for week 6, and the film that we are watching happens to be entitled Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And what I will be discussing is from Projected Fears, Chapter 2, The Thing from Another World, and Nightmares, Chapter 4, Body Snatchers. And this is when your second journal will be due on Dracula, though you could certainly hand it in earlier, but by that point we would have already discussed Dracula. And then we go to October 14th, where we are talking about horror film in the 1960s. And the film we're watching is Psycho. And I'm talking about Chapter 3 in Projected Fears, which is devoted to Psycho, as well as Chapter 5 in Nightmares, that's entitled California Gothic, and Chapter 12 in the same text that's devoted to Alfred Hitchcock. And that would also be the time where you would be handing in your journal about Cat People, because we would have already finished that unit. I cheated. When we get to week 8, I've got Horror Film in the 1960s, Part 2. When we get to the 1960s, we'll talk about what a seminal decade that was in terms of horror film. And the second horror film we will be watching from the 1960s, and that'll be on the 21st of October, is Night of the Living Dead. And in terms of what I'll be discussing is Chapter 4 from Projected Fears, entitled Night of the Living Dead. And from the text Nightmares, Chapter 6, which talks about apocalypse, and chapter 14, which talks about George Romero. And that's also the date where you would be handing in a journal about Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We get to week 9, and this is horror film in the 1970s, and the film we will be watching is The Exorcist. If you've never seen that film before, it is very graphic. It's one of the reasons for the disclaimer that I have for this particular class. What we'll be talking about in Projected Fears is chapter 5, which is entitled Exorcist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And while we aren't watching Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I will discuss it somewhat. And also, I will be talking about chapter 3 from horror film, which is about films from 1974 to the present. When we get to week 10, there's a little bit more cheating from my part. Week 10, which is the 4th of November, we're talking about horror film of the 1980s, but we are going to be watching a horror film that debuted technically in 1978, and that film happens to be called Halloween. But that film led to a genre, a slasher film genre of the 1980s. So, therefore, I wanted us to see what led to the beginning of that, and that would be Halloween, which came out in 1978, but really did influence the entire decade of the 1980s. And what we'll talk about in Projected Fears is chapter 6, which is devoted to Halloween, and in Nightmares, chapter 7, which is entitled Shrinking Man, and chapter 15, which is devoted to John Carpenter. And the 4th of November is also when you're handing in a journal for Night of the Living Dead. And again, worry not if you can't keep to all of the due dates, just ask for an extension. I'll be happy to grant it. Chapter 11, or I should say week 11, and that happens to be the 11th of November, horror film of the 1990s, where we will be watching The Blair Witch Project and talking about in Nightmares, chapter 8, Postmodern Horror 1, and chapter 9, Postmodern Horror 2. As well as in horror film chapter 9, Digital Horrors. And that's when you would be handing in a journal for The Exorcist. Week 12, that gets us to the 18th of November, horror film in the 2000s. That film is 28 days later, and I can say that that film happens to be about a virus plague. That said, by this point last semester, we had already transitioned online. And I asked my students in that particular class if they thought last semester this would be an appropriate film to watch, considering our current reality, or if it was a little bit too close to home. And it was universal that, yes, they wanted to watch that film because they thought that it would be not only timely, but would offer us useful lessons. So I thought about that, and I've kept that on the syllabus for us for week 12, 28 days later. When we get a bit closer to that class, depending on world events, if we feel that that film is just going to be a little bit too uncomfortable for all of us, I could easily change that film for another film. Again, it happens to be about a virus plague in Britain, if you're not familiar with the film. So we can decide that together when we get to the 18th, whether that film needs to be substituted or whether we could continue on. But I must say that it really is a very well-made film, and I think it would be wonderful for us to examine it. And then what we would be talking about that week would be from Projected Fears, the conclusion of their text, and also in horror film, chapter 7, Spooky Sounds. And that's when you would be submitting in Journal 8, Halloween. And then when we get to the 25th of November, that happens to be Thanksgiving, and no classes will be scheduled for Thanksgiving, so we wouldn't have anything on that class. On the 12th of December is when we would be watching our last film. On the 2nd of December is when we would be watching our last film from the 2010s, and that film happens to be Get Out by Jordan Peele. And that came out in 2017. And then we would also be discussing in the text horror film chapter 8. It's known as Colors of Fear. That's where you would be handing in the Blair Witch Project. Our last week would just be for summary. If there's something that you wanted to do that was creative, that would involve the class as a whole, that's something that you could present during that particular class, if you so would like to do something like that. That would also be the week where you would have 2 journals due, just because I wanted to give you that break after the first journal so that you could get an idea of how I would evaluate it. That would leave 2 films for you to respond to by the 9th of December, and that would be 28 days later, assuming that we make the decision to watch 28 days later, and then finally Get Out. So In terms of where we are, that would just leave a final examination, which was scheduled by GCC to be on Wednesday the 16th during our Wednesday evening class time. So I'm thinking that we can still keep to that particular date. I would post the final, and then you would have approximately 48 hours or 24 hours to respond to that final. And then, and of course, if we needed to negotiate additional time, we could do that. And then that would put closure to the class itself. So in relation to where we are, any suggestions or feedback you have for formatting the class, please send me an email and let me know. In relation to us beginning next week, if you can please try to have the readings that I have scheduled done by that time, because I will be discussing them. And for today's attendance question, if we were meeting in class, what we would do is we would go around the room and introduce ourselves. And obviously we can't do that, but I thought that would suffice as today's attendance question in our class discussion forum section, which you can see posted along with the syllabus and other materials, where I'm going to ask you to briefly introduce yourself to the class. Feel free to upload pictures or video, but not required, just so that we can all get a little bit of a sense of who happens to be in the class, and perhaps even some of the reasons why they elected to take a class in something that many people would avoid, horror film. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I look forward to the semester. Take care. Bye-bye.